On the freezing early morning of February 15th, 1994, the biting wind of Chicago's South Side carried more than just the winter chill. It carried the acrid, undeniable stench of death as 11 people perished in a roaring inferno at an abandoned building on the corner of 68th and Paxton, a tragedy that would etch itself into the city's history not merely for the staggering loss of life, but for the chillingly trivial reason behind the execution. All the victims were young, ranging in age, and they were all associated with a local street crew known as the Disciples. But the catalyst for this massacre wasn't a territorial dispute over drug corners, nor was it a $1 million debt gone wrong. Instead, the spark that ignited a fire hot, enough to melt glass and fuse bone, was a simple leather jacket stolen during a dice game exactly 2 weeks prior. If you have the courage to hear this story, to stare directly into the abyss of human pride and the catastrophic cost of a twisted code of honor, leave your like and subscribe to the channel right now, because we are about to descend into a narrative so dark that it challenges the very definition of humanity. What you are about to hear is not fiction. This is not a Hollywood screenplay designed to entertain you on a lazy weekend. This is a chronicle of real events, a wound on the city of Chicago that has never fully healed, a scar that remains tender to the touch even decades later. Over the next hour, we will walk through the frozen streets of West Englewood, we will sit in the smoke-filled basements where grudges were born, and we will stand helplessly outside a burning building as 11 souls fight for air that no longer exists. We will examine the psychology of killers who believed they were judges, jurors, and executioners, all over an article of clothing that today you might find in any thrift store for $20. This is the story of the 68th and Paxton fire. This is the story of the Johnson brothers. And this is a cautionary tale about what happens when respect becomes more important than life itself. West Englewood in the early 1990s was a neighborhood under siege, a place where the American dream had long since metastasized into a recurring nightmare of poverty, neglect, and violence, where the crumbling brick facades of 2 flats stood like tombstones marking the graves of a once vibrant community. To understand the magnitude of what happened on that February morning, you must first understand the world that created both the victims and the perpetrators. West Englewood was not always the war zone it had become by the decade's turn. In the 1950s and 60s, this was a solidly working-class area, a destination for families fleeing the overcrowded tenements of the inner city, a place where a man could work a factory job at Wisconsin Steel or pull a shift at the stockyards and afford a modest home with a patch of grass out front. But the latter half of the 20th century was not kind to industrial cities like Chicago. The factories closed, the jobs vanished, and with them went the economic foundation that held communities together. By 1994, West Englewood had become a textbook example of urban decay. The population had plummeted, and those who could leave did, fleeing to safer neighborhoods or distant suburbs, leaving behind a demographic stranded by poverty and systemic neglect. The buildings reflected this despair. Block after block was pockmarked with abandoned structures, hollow shells where families once gathered for Sunday dinners, now serving as crack houses, gang dens, and shelters for the homeless. The L train still rattled overhead on its elevated tracks, but it no longer carried workers to prosperity. It carried them through a landscape that felt foreign and hostile. Vacant lots filled with garbage, and weeds stood where corner stores once sold penny candy. The only thriving businesses were the liquor stores, the currency exchanges, and the fast food joints that dotted the main arteries. It was here, amidst the boarded-up storefronts and the rattling of the L train, that Marcus and Terrell Johnson were raised. The Johnson family had deep roots in the neighborhood. Their father, an aging man named Leroy Johnson, had arrived in Chicago during the Great Migration, coming up from Mississippi with nothing but the clothes on his back and an unshakable work ethic. He had found employment in the stockyards, had raised 3 children, and had watched with despair as the world he built crumbled around him. But Leroy was a survivor, and he raised his sons to be survivors too, though the lessons he imparted would be twisted by the environment in which they were applied. Leroy taught his sons that a man's word was his bond, that respect was non-negotiable, and that any sign of weakness would be exploited by predators. In another time, in another place, these lessons might have produced upstanding citizens, men of integrity who commanded respect through hard work and moral fortitude. But in the crucible of West Englewood, surrounded by wolves, these lessons produced something far more dangerous. The Johnson brothers were not your typical chaotic street thugs acting on impulse. They were disciplined, terrifyingly calm, and raised by a father who instilled in them a rigid, almost samurai-like code of respect that dictated that any slight, no matter how small, had to be met with overwhelming force to ensure it never happened again. Marcus, 22 years old, and Terrell, 20, moved through the streets with a quiet authority, their reputation built not on loud threats but on the promise of action. They were not the type to flash weapons or engage in loud arguments on street corners. They were observers, students of human behavior, men who understood that power was not demonstrated through noise, but through the certainty of consequence. When Marcus Johnson walked down 68th Street, people moved aside, not because he was large, though he was tall and powerfully built, but because his eyes held a stillness that was unnerving, the stillness of a man who had already decided what he was capable of and had made peace with it. Yet their sanctuary was violated on a cold night in late January when a local rival named Ray Ray, a loudmouth member of a splinter faction of the Gangster Disciples, decided to test the boundaries of the Johnson name. To understand Ray Ray, you have to understand the fractured nature of gang politics in 1990s Chicago. The once unified black gangster disciple nation, founded by Larry Hoover and David Barksdale, had splintered into countless factions, each claiming allegiance to the larger entity but operating with near total autonomy on the street level. Ray Ray was a product of this fragmentation. He was young, probably no older than 19, and he was eager to make a name for himself. He had watched the Johnson brothers operate with an envy that bordered on obsession. They had what he wanted: respect, fear, and territory. And in the zero-sum game of street economics, the only way to gain status was to take it from someone else. It was a basement dice game, the air thick with cigarette smoke and the smell of stale malt liquor, when the dice tumbled across the linoleum floor and an argument erupted over a payout, a common occurrence in the underground economy of the South Side. But what happened next shifted the timeline toward inevitable tragedy. These dice games were the unofficial stock exchanges of the ghetto, places where money changed hands rapidly, where fortunes were won and lost on the roll of a cube, and where tensions always simmered just beneath the surface. The location that night was a basement apartment on 69th Street, a cramped space with water stains on the ceiling and furniture that had seen better decades. About a dozen men were crowded around a makeshift table, a sheet of plywood balanced on cinder blocks, illuminated by a single bare bulb hanging from a wire. Money was scattered across the surface, crumpled bills of various denominations, along with plastic cups of malt liquor and ashtrays overflowing with cigarette butts. Marcus Johnson was there, seated at the head of the table, his black leather bomber jacket draped over his shoulders like a king's robe. This jacket was not merely a piece of clothing, it was an artifact of his status. It was a vintage-style aviator jacket, made of thick, high-quality leather that had softened with age, bearing the patina of years of wear. Marcus had acquired it under circumstances he never fully explained, but in the mythology of the neighborhood, it was said to have belonged to an older gangster from a previous generation, a man who had met a violent end and whose possessions were distributed among those deemed worthy. Whether this story was true or apocryphal mattered little. The jacket had become part of Marcus's identity. When he wore it, he was not just Marcus Johnson. He was Marcus Johnson, the man who commanded respect, the man who could not be touched. Ray entered the game late, accompanied by two of his associates, men with shifty eyes and weapons bulging beneath their coats. The game continued for a while, the dice rolling, money changing hands, the usual rhythm of wins and losses. But Ray was losing, and losing badly. His money was disappearing, his frustration mounting, and his eyes kept drifting to the jacket draped over Marcus's chair. In Ray's mind, the jacket represented everything he lacked. It was a symbol of status he could not achieve through his own efforts, a prize that would elevate him in the eyes of his peers. When an argument erupted over a disputed roll of the dice, Ray saw his opportunity. Ray, emboldened by his crew and the weapons tucked into their waistbands, didn't just take the money, he demanded the black leather bomber jacket Marcus was wearing. The room fell silent. Everyone present understood the gravity of what was being asked. This was not a request for collateral, this was a challenge to Marcus's very identity. Marcus stared at Ray, his expression unchanged, his eyes betraying nothing. He simply said no. It was not a defiant no, not a loud or aggressive refusal. It was a quiet, absolute negation, the kind of no that leaves no room for negotiation. And in that moment, Ray made a decision that would ultimately cost 11 lives. He stood up, pulled a pistol from his waistband, and with a swift, brutal motion, brought the butt of the weapon down against Marcus's skull. The sound was sickening, a wet crack that echoed off the basement walls. Marcus slumped forward, blood immediately streaming from the wound, staining the floor and splattering onto the dice. Before he could recover, Ray's associates were on him, holding him down as Ray himself reached over and stripped the jacket from Marcus's back. The room was filled with the laughter of Ray's crew, a cruel, mocking sound that seemed to bounce off every surface. Marcus, on his knees, bleeding onto the linoleum, looked up and met Ray's eyes. He did not speak. He did not threaten. He simply memorized the face, the moment, and the humiliation. In the world of the Johnson brothers, this wasn't just a robbery. It was a spiritual execution, a public dismantling of their manhood that could not stand if they intended to continue living in the neighborhood. As Marcus stumbled out into the snow that night, blood trickling down his neck, the clock began to tick toward a retribution that would be biblical in its scope. Terrell, who had been present but had remained motionless throughout the assault, helped his brother outside. They did not speak as they walked through the frozen streets. They did not need to. Both brothers understood that the world had shifted. The status quo had been shattered, and the only question remaining was how much of the world would be burned down in response. The jacket was gone, but the debt had just been incurred, and the Johnsons always collected their debts with interest. For 2 weeks, the neighborhood was deceptively quiet, a calm that settled over the blocks like a heavy wool blanket. But inside the Johnson household, there was no peace, only the meticulous, cold planning of mass murder. The brothers went about their daily routines with an almost eerie normalcy. They were seen on the streets, they attended to their business, they even exchanged pleasantries with neighbors who had heard rumors of the incident. But behind the facade, their minds were working with the precision of military tacticians. They did not want to simply kill Ray Ray. Killing Ray Ray would be too easy, too quick, too merciful. They wanted Ray Ray to suffer, to experience fear, to understand in his final moments that his actions had consequences beyond anything he could have imagined. They didn't want to just kill Ray Ray. They wanted to eradicate the entire nest of vipers, to send a message so loud that it would echo through the Cook County Jail for generations. This is a crucial distinction that separates the Johnson brothers from typical street criminals. Most acts of violence in the drug trade are instrumental, means to an end, whether that end is territory, money, or eliminating a rival. But the Johnson brothers were seeking something more abstract and far more dangerous. They were seeking vindication. They wanted to create an event so catastrophic, so overwhelming in its horror, that no one would ever again dare to disrespect them. They were not just killing Ray Ray, they were killing the very concept of challenging their authority. And so they watched the abandoned two-story brick building where Ray Ray and his crew squatted, a structure that had become a drug den and a flophouse for the gang. The building at 68th and Paxton was typical of the neighborhood's decay. It had once been a mixed-use structure, possibly a corner store with apartments above, but those days were long gone. The storefront windows were boarded up with plywood, the brick facade was stained and crumbling, and the interior had been stripped of anything valuable by scavengers years ago. But it provided shelter, and in the brutal Chicago winter, shelter was a valuable commodity. Ray Ray and his associates had claimed it as their own, running their operations from its shadowy interior and using it as a place to sleep when they had nowhere else to go. They tracked the movements of the occupants with the patience of apex predators, noting that every night the heavy steel door at the front was bolstered by a makeshift barricade. But the back door, the only other exit, was secured merely by a latch. They observed the patterns of the building's inhabitants. They noted who came and went, what times the lights went out, how many people were present on any given night. They watched as young women arrived, sometimes staying overnight, sometimes leaving in the early morning hours. They saw teenagers, barely old enough to drive, coming to buy drugs and leaving quickly with their heads down. They cataloged it all, building a detailed intelligence picture of the target, waiting for the right moment to strike. On the afternoon of February 14th, while the rest of the city prepared for Valentine's Day, Marcus and Terrell visited a local hardware store, not to buy flowers or chocolates, but to purchase a heavy-duty master padlock and a 5-gallon gas can, their faces betraying absolutely no emotion as they paid cash and walked out into the gray afternoon. The hardware store clerk, a middle-aged man named Arthur, would later testify that he remembered the brothers distinctly. He remembered because most people buying gas cans in February were either preparing for winter emergencies or, in this neighborhood, engaged in some kind of illicit activity. But what stuck with Arthur was their demeanor. They did not joke, they did not make small talk, they did not even glance at each other. They simply paid, took their purchases, and walked out into the cold as if they were buying groceries. Arthur would later describe feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. The sun set, bleeding out of the sky over Chicago, plunging West Englewood into darkness, and the temperature plummeted to a bone-chilling 10 degrees, driving everyone indoors and leaving the streets empty. A perfect stage for the horror that was to come. February 14th, 1994, was a Monday. Valentine's Day fell on a Monday that year, which meant that the usual weekend revelry had died down, and the city was settling into the work week. For the inhabitants of the abandoned building, it was just another night of survival. They huddled together for warmth, burning trash in a metal barrel for heat. passing around bottles of cheap alcohol to numb the cold and the despair. Inside that building, which would soon become a tomb, were 11 people. Some hardened gang members, but others just hangers-on, girlfriends, and even a pregnant teenager named Tanesha, all seeking shelter from the cold, unaware that they were sleeping inside a structure that was being converted into a furnace. At 11:27 p.m., witnesses later recalled seeing a beat-up sedan circling the block, the headlights off, moving like a phantom shark in deep water, as the brothers waited for the lights inside the abandoned building to flicker out, signaling that the occupants had passed out from a night of drinking and smoking. The sedan was an old Buick, nondescript and faded, the kind of car that blended into the neighborhood's landscape of neglect. Inside, Marcus and Terrell sat in silence, watching, waiting, their breath forming small clouds in the unheated vehicle. They watched as one by one, the small flickers of candlelight or flashlight from within the building went dark. They listened to the distant sounds of the city, the occasional siren, the rumble of a passing truck on a nearby thoroughfare, the wind whistling through broken windows, and they waited for the moment when sleep claimed the occupants, when consciousness surrendered to the oblivion that precedes death. At 1:45 a.m., the brothers made their move, parking their car 3 blocks away in an alley to avoid identification, carrying the heavy gas can which sloshed rhythmically with every step, the smell of the high-octane fuel already permeating the air around them. The streets were utterly deserted. The cold was so intense that even the most hardened street dwellers had found shelter. The only sounds were the crunch of their footsteps in the snow and the liquid sloshing of the gasoline. They moved with purpose, neither speaking, each knowing exactly what role they would play. The gas can was heavy, 5 gallons of accelerant, enough to turn a wooden building into an inferno. The smell was overpowering, a chemical stench that burned the nostrils, but they pressed on, their faces set in expressions of grim determination. They approached the back of the building first, the snow crunching softly under their boots, and in a move of chilling cruelty, Marcus took the padlock they had purchased hours earlier and secured the back door from the outside, clicking the shackle shut with a sound that sealed the fate of everyone inside. There was now no escape, only a singular choke point entrance that would soon be engulfed in flames. This act, perhaps more than any other, reveals the depth of the brothers' malice. They were not simply setting a fire, they were engineering a death trap. They understood that in a fire, panic is as deadly as the flames. They understood that human beings, when faced with imminent death, will fight desperately for any exit. By securing the back door, they ensured that the fight would be futile. They ensured that the occupants would be channeled toward the front, toward the inferno they were about to create. It was a calculated act of cruelty that demonstrates a mind capable of divorcing itself entirely from the humanity of its targets. They moved to the front, the wind howling through the broken windows of adjacent properties, masking the sound of their movements as Terrell unscrewed the cap of the gas can and began to pour the accelerant with methodical precision. He didn't just splash it on the door, he poured it under the threshold, soaking the rotting wood of the entryway, dousing the staircase that served as the building's only artery, ensuring that the fire would not just burn, but explode upward, following the path of the oxygen like a living, breathing dragon. The gasoline flowed in rivulets, seeping into every crack and crevice, pooling on the wooden porch, soaking into the dry, decades-old lumber. The fumes were overwhelming, a chemical fog that should have woken the occupants. But the stupor of the night's indulgences kept them locked in a sleep, that would transition seamlessly into death. At 2:14 a.m., Marcus struck a single match, the small flame flickering aggressively in the wind, a tiny point of light that held the potential for infinite destruction. And without a word, without a moment of hesitation or a second thought for the pregnant girl or the teenagers who had nothing to do with the jacket, he flicked the match onto the gasoline-soaked porch. The reaction was instantaneous and violent, a whoosh of ignition that sounded like a jet engine starting up, the fire leaping from the floor to the ceiling in a fraction of a second. The heat so intense that it shattered the front windows immediately, feeding the flames with a fresh rush of oxygen. That turned the staircase into a chimney of pure hellfire. The brothers did not stay to watch. They turned and walked away, their work complete, the sounds of the growing inferno behind them mixing with the wind. They did not run. They did not look back. They walked calmly to their car, drove away, and returned home, where they would later claim to have been sleeping. They left behind them a building that was rapidly becoming an oven, and inside that oven, 11 people were waking up to the worst nightmare imaginable. Inside, the nightmare began instantly. The occupants woke to the sound of roaring flames and the choking, thick black smoke that filled their lungs with every panicked breath, scrambling in the dark, tripping over one another as the temperature in the hallway spiked to over 1,000 degrees. Within minutes, imagine, if you can, the terror of that moment. You are asleep, perhaps dreaming, perhaps in a drug-induced stupor, and suddenly you are awake, unable to see, unable to breathe, surrounded by a roar like a freight train and a heat that feels like it is melting your skin. You cannot see the exit because the smoke is black and thick, filling your lungs with every desperate gasp. You cannot think clearly because panic is short-circuiting every rational process in your brain. All you know is that you have to get out. You have to find air. You have to escape this heat that is searing your lungs with every breath. They rush to the back door, their only hope for salvation, piling up against the wood, screaming, clawing, and battering the frame, only to find it held fast by the padlock, an unyielding barrier of hardened steel that turned their sanctuary into a gas chamber. The screams that emanated from that building were described by neighbors as unearthly, a chorus of agony that rose above the crackling of the timber and the shattering of glass, sounds that would haunt the first responders for the rest of their lives. Neighbors living nearby would later testify that they were awakened by the screams so desperate and terrifying that they seemed to come from another dimension. They looked out their windows to see the building fully engulfed, flames leaping from every opening, and they could hear, above the roar of the fire, the sounds of human beings dying. Firefighters arrived at 2:22 a.m., just 8 minutes after ignition, but the building was already fully engulfed, a glowing skeleton against the night sky, the heat so intense that it melted the siding off the house next door and forced the fire crews to fight a defensive battle, unable to enter the structure to attempt a rescue. The first engine company on the scene was met with a wall of heat so intense that they could not approach within 50 feet without their protective gear beginning to fail. The officer in charge made the agonizing decision to fight the fire from the exterior, knowing that to send his men inside would be to send them to their deaths. They could hear the banging on the back door, the desperate, rhythmic thumping of human bodies throwing themselves against the barricade, a sound that slowed, and then, one by one, stopped, until the only sound was the roar of the fire and the hissing of water turning to steam. When the flames were finally extinguished hours later, as the dawn broke over a city in shock, the firefighters moved into the smoldering ruins to begin the grim task of recovery. And what they found broke even the most hardened veterans of the department. Bodies were found piled against the back door, fused together in a grotesque sculpture of desperation. Skin charred beyond recognition, limbs entangled in a final embrace of terror. The scene inside the building was apocalyptic. The heat had been so intense that glass had melted and fused, that metal had warped and twisted, that human bone had calcified and crumbled. The bodies were not immediately recognizable as human. They were charcoal shapes, twisted forms that had to be examined by coroners to determine even basic details like age and gender. They were found in a pile at the back door, a testament to their final futile struggle for survival. They had died together, clutching each other, their final moments spent in terror and agony. The coroner's vans lined the street like a funeral procession, taking away 11 body bags, including the unborn child of Tanesha, a generation wiped out in a single night because of a piece of leather and a bruised ego. Tanesha was only 17 years old. She was 5 months pregnant. She had gone to the abandoned building that night to visit her boyfriend, a young man named Darnell who was entangled in Ray Ray's crew. She had no involvement in the dice game, no knowledge of the stolen jacket, no connection to the code of honor that demanded blood. She was simply a teenager seeking warmth and companionship on a cold winter night, and she paid for that choice with her life and the life of her unborn child. Her mother would later collapse in the courtroom when the verdict was read, her wails echoing through the halls of justice. The investigation that followed was swift and brutal. Fueled by the sheer magnitude of the crime and the community's outrage, there was no no-snitch code strong enough to protect the perpetrators of a massacre this vile. In the hours after the fire, as the bodies were being removed, detectives began the painstaking process of piecing together what had happened. The padlock on the back door was an immediate red flag. It was new, it was heavy-duty, and it had been placed there deliberately. This was not an accidental fire. This was murder. Word spread through the neighborhood with astonishing speed. People who would never have spoken to police about a routine shooting or a drug deal found their tongues loosened by the horror of what had occurred. Witnesses placed the Johnson brothers at the scene. The hardware store clerk identified them from the padlock purchase, and the gas station attendant remembered the sullen young men filling a can in the middle of the night. When detectives brought Marcus and Terrell in for interrogation, there were no tears, no trembling confessions of guilt, only a cold, stony silence that eventually cracked not into remorse, but into justification. They spoke of the jacket, of the disrespect, of the necessity of what they did as if they were discussing a business transaction rather than the murder of 11 human beings. The interrogations were recorded, and portions of those tapes would later be played in court. On them, you can hear the brothers' calm, measured voices explaining their actions. They did not deny setting the fire. They did not express sorrow for the deaths. Instead, they explained, in rational terms, that they had been left with no choice. They had been disrespected in public. They had been humiliated. If they had not responded, their standing in the neighborhood would have been destroyed, and they would have been targeted by every predator who smelled weakness. The fire, they argued, was not an act of murder, but an act of survival. The trial was a media circus, a window into the nihilism that had gripped parts of the city, where the value of life had depreciated below the cost of a jacket. And as the judge read the sentences, life without the possibility of parole, Marcus looked back at the sobbing families of the victims with a look of utter indifference, a final act of defiance that chilled the courtroom to its core. The trial lasted 6 weeks. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence, including the physical evidence from the scene, the witness testimony, and the brothers' own words from the interrogation tapes. The defense attempted to argue that the fire was an accident, that the brothers had only intended to scare the occupants, not kill them. But the padlock on the back door made that argument impossible to sustain. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on 11 counts of first-degree murder. Today, the lot where the building stood is an empty patch of grass, a scar on the neighborhood that refuses to heal, and the Johnson brothers sit in maximum security cells, aging men who traded their freedom and 11 lives for a fleeting sense of restored honor. The corner of 68th and Paxton looks like countless other corners in Chicago. There is a vacant lot, some weeds, perhaps a makeshift memorial that fades with each passing year. The families of the victims still live with the loss, still gather on anniversaries to remember those who died, still struggle to make sense of a tragedy that defies rational explanation. The Johnson brothers, now middle-aged men, spend their days in the Illinois Department of Corrections, their world reduced to cell blocks and exercise yards. Their names synonymous with one of the most senseless mass murders in Chicago history. This story forces us to look in the mirror and ask uncomfortable questions about the nature of revenge, about how a culture of violence can warp the mind until murder feels like logic, and about the fragility of life in the face of unchecked pride. There is a temptation to dismiss the Johnson brothers as monsters, as aberrations, as beings so different from ourselves that we cannot possibly understand them. But the truth is more disturbing. The Johnson brothers were products of their environment, shaped by a code of honor that, in a different context, might have been admirable. Their desire for respect, their commitment to defending their reputation, their willingness to back up their words with action, these are traits that we often celebrate in other settings. It was the environment, the culture, and the absence of any alternative that twisted these traits into something monstrous. If this story made you think about honor, revenge, and the terrible price we pay when we let our egos drive the car, leave your like, share this video to spread the message, and tell me in the comments, what is the true cost of respect? And was there any part of you that understood the Johnson brothers' rage, even if you despised their actions? We want to hear your thoughts. Do you believe that some insults demand a response no matter the cost? Or do you see the Johnson brothers as nothing more than cold-blooded killers who deserve no understanding whatsoever? The comment section is open for your discussion. And remember, in a world where violence is often the first resort, we must ask ourselves what we are willing to sacrifice on the altar of pride. Until next time, this has been a journey into the darkness. Stay safe, stay thoughtful, and never forget the value of a single human life.